The city always looked clean from a distance. White marble, wide avenues, flags that moved as if they understood their responsibility. But up close, Washington carried tension in its bones. Dean Martin noticed that the moment his plane touched down at National Airport, he had been to Washington before, charity events, military performances, one gala dinner, but this trip felt different. The invitation had come quietly. No press, no announcement, no entourage. Just a message passed through trusted channels. The president would like to meet you privately. No photographers, no publicity, just a conversation. Dean had stared at the letter longer than he cared to admit. He had built a life on laughter, charm, and a relaxed shrug that told the world nothing bothered him. But this invitation had weight. Not celebrity weight. Not Hollywood weight, history weight. He declined the offer of a private jet. It had been suggested. Instead, he flew commercial, quietly, window seat, hat pulled low. No one bothered him. That was the strange thing about fame. Sometimes it disappeared when you needed it to. A government sedan met him at the curb. No flashing lights, no ceremony. Just a driver with a steady expression and a clipped tone. "Good afternoon, Mr. Martin." They drove without conversation. Washington passed outside the window. Monuments, government buildings, autumn trees shedding their leaves as if the season itself was exhausted. Dean found himself wondering why the meeting required such discretion. He wasn't a diplomat. He wasn't a policy advisor. He was a singer, an actor, a man who told jokes. Why him? On the side entrance. They didn't enter through the main gates. No tourists. No visible guards standing at attention for photographs. Instead, the car curved toward a less visible access point, a controlled gate with layered security. The driver spoke softly. "We'll go through here." Inside, the corridors were surprisingly ordinary. Fluorescent lighting, muted walls, office carpet. The White House, at least from the back corridors, felt less like a palace and more like a workplace that never slept. A young Secret Service agent walked ahead. Straight posture, controlled breathing, professional calm. Dean noticed the details, how the agent's eyes moved first before his head did, how he scanned corners before turning. This wasn't theater. This was vigilance. They stopped at a modest waiting room, a sofa, 2 chairs, and a low table stacked with magazines. No grandeur, no ceremony. Dean sat and waited. The weight of protection time stretched. 10 minutes, 15. He picked up a magazine but didn't read it. Instead, he studied the silence. Even the quiet here felt monitored. Finally, the door opened. But it wasn't the president. It was the Attorney General. Robert F. Kennedy entered with an intensity that altered the air in the room. He was composed but not relaxed. Alert but not welcoming. "Mr. Martin." They shook hands. The grip was firm, direct, evaluating. "Thank you for coming," Bobby said. The words were polite, the tone measured. Dean nodded. "Hard to turn down an invitation like this." A small pause followed, not hostile, but deliberate. "My brother appreciates entertainers," Bobby said. He believes culture matters." Dean offered a faint smile. "I appreciate that." Another pause. "And we appreciate loyalty." The word lingered longer than the rest. Dean understood immediately. Washington was not Hollywood. Here, associations carried meaning, relationships were examined, friendships were scrutinized. "I'm here as a guest," Dean replied calmly. "Nothing more." Bobby studied him for a moment, not accusatory, not friendly, just assessing. "We take security seriously," he said. "Everyone who enters this building does so under responsibility." "I understand." Another silence. Then Bobby stepped aside slightly as footsteps approached. The president enters. John F. Kennedy moved with a practiced ease that almost disguised fatigue. Up close, he looked younger than photographs suggested, but also more burdened. But he smiled immediately. "Dean Martin, I'm glad you came." The smile reached his eyes. The tension in the room softened. Dean stood and extended his hand. Their handshake was firm but natural, not ceremonial. "Thank you for inviting me, Mr. President." "Jack," Kennedy corrected gently. "If we're going to talk, let's talk like men." Bobby watched for a second longer than necessary, then quietly excused himself. The door closed. The air shifted again. A different kind of conversation. They didn't go to the Oval Office. Instead, Kennedy led him into a smaller sitting room, more personal. Books, family photographs, a desk with handwritten notes stacked neatly. Kennedy poured 2 glasses of scotch. "No press," he said casually. "No photographers. Just conversation." Dean nodded. The first few minutes were light. Films, or touring, family. Kennedy had a surprisingly detailed memory of scenes from one of Dean's recent movies. "My wife enjoys your work," he said. "You make things look effortless." Dean laughed softly. "It takes a lot of effort to look like you're not trying." Kennedy's smile widened. "Politics is the same." They talked about public pressure, how it builds invisibly. Kennedy admitted something unexpected. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "the loneliest place in the country is this building." Dean didn't interrupt. Kennedy continued. "Everyone wants something. Influence, access, policy changes, recognition. It's rare to have a conversation that doesn't carry weight." Dean leaned back slightly. "Well," he said, "I don't need anything from you." That was the moment something shifted. Kennedy's shoulders relaxed, not dramatically, but noticeably. They spoke for nearly an hour, not about policy, not about strategy, about expectation, about family pressure, about the strange loneliness that comes with public success. Dean shared stories about touring, how crowds cheer, but hotel rooms remain silent. Kennedy listened, and when Kennedy spoke about decision-making, about carrying consequences that ripple beyond imagination, Dean didn't offer advice. He just listened. That, more than anything, mattered. The interruption. A discreet knock at the door. "Mr. President," a voice said softly, "your briefing is ready." Kennedy sighed, but not in frustration, in inevitability. He stood. "So it begins again." Dean rose as well. They shook hands once more. This time, Kennedy held the handshake half a second longer. "Thank you," he said quietly. It's good to be reminded that conversation can just be conversation." Dean nodded. "Anytime." As he exited through the corridor, he noticed something subtle. The Secret Service agents were closer now, not intrusive, but present. Bobby stood further down the hallway. He didn't speak this time, but he watched. And that look wasn't hostility. It was protection. Relentless, unyielding protection. The attempt to stop it later, as Dean approached the exit corridor, there was a brief pause. An agent stepped forward slightly. "Mr. Martin, one moment." Dean stopped. Not detained, but assessed. Behind the professionalism was something else. Caution layered over fatigue. The agent looked toward Bobby briefly before speaking. "All interactions are logged, standard procedure." Dean nodded. I understand." What Dean understood then, and would understand more deeply later, was this. The Secret Service wasn't trying to stop a handshake. They were trying to control unpredictability, and unpredictability can look like warmth. It can look like laughter. It can look like 2 men talking honestly. But in Washington, unpredictability is risk, and risk is the enemy of protection. The real reason. On the flight back to Los Angeles, Dean didn't sleep. He replayed the meeting in his mind. Not the words, the pauses, the sighs, the weight in Kennedy's voice when he spoke about responsibility. It wasn't fear he had seen. It was awareness, an understanding that leadership carries invisible cost. And Bobby? Bobby wasn't paranoid. He was guarding something fragile. A brother, a presidency, a family legacy. Now, sometimes protection looks like suspicion. Sometimes loyalty looks like distance. Sometimes the people trying hardest to keep someone safe accidentally build walls around them. That was the tension Dean felt in that hallway. Not hostility, conflict between security and humanity. 2 weeks later, when news broke in Dallas, the world changed in a single afternoon. Dean watched it on television. The same man he had spoken with privately, the same man who had laughed about movie scenes, was gone. Suddenly, that handshake carried gravity. That conversation became permanent. He thought about something Kennedy had said quietly near the end of their talk. Human connection is rare in this job. Dean realized something painful. The Secret Service had tried to manage risk. Bobby had tried to manage threat. But neither could manage fate, what the handshake meant. Years later, Dean would describe that meeting simply, he just wanted to talk. No drama, no secrets, no conspiracy. Just two men from very different worlds sharing one unguarded hour. The Secret Service hadn't tried to stop danger. They had tried to stop unpredictability. And sometimes unpredictability is simply authenticity. That handshake wasn't political. It wasn't strategic. It wasn't transactional. It was human. And in Washington, that can feel dangerous, not because it threatens power, but because it reminds people that behind power is a person. Los Angeles, November 1963, felt strangely disconnected from the rest of the country. The palm trees still moved in the same lazy rhythm. The ocean still rolled in without hesitation. Nightclubs still opened their doors as if nothing had shifted. But inside homes across America, something fragile had shattered. Dean Martin sat in his living room, the television casting pale light across the walls, replaying the same footage over and over again. The motorcade, the confusion, the urgency, the disbelief. He had spoken to that man only weeks earlier. He had heard him laugh. He had watched him loosen his tie slightly as if relieved to be off stage for a moment. And now the nation was watching history collapse in real time. The handshake replayed in Dean's mind far more vividly than the news broadcast. It had not been dramatic. It had not been staged. It had simply been two men standing in a quiet room, acknowledging each other without pretense. Yet now that moment carried the kind of weight that only hindsight can create. Dean found himself wondering whether he had missed something in Kennedy's tone, some hidden tremor or unspoken fear. But when he searched his memory honestly, he found none. There had been awareness, yes, but not prophecy. Kennedy had not spoken like a man expecting immediate tragedy. He had spoken like someone who understood the cost of visibility and had accepted it long ago. Within days, Washington hardened. Grief turned into investigation. Investigation turned into scrutiny. Everyone who had seen the president in his final weeks was questioned, cataloged, analyzed. Dean received a formal request for an interview. It was polite on paper but carried the unmistakable firmness of authority. When he arrived at the federal building in Los Angeles, he could feel the emotional tension before he even entered the room. Robert Kennedy looked exhausted, not angry in the way Dean had once interpreted him, but hollowed. Grief had stripped away sharp edges and replaced them with something heavier and more fragile. The interview was thorough but controlled. Bobby asked detailed questions about the meeting. Not accusations, not threats, just an intensity born of loss. He asked whether Jack had seemed distracted, whether he mentioned specific concerns, whether any unusual names came up in conversation. Dean answered honestly. They had spoken about movies, about children, about pressure. They had spoken about the loneliness of leadership. When Dean repeated the president's reflection about valuing human connection, Bobby's composure wavered. It was not rage this time. It was recognition. And he understood something in that statement that perhaps he had missed while his brother was alive. The tension between them no longer felt adversarial. It felt tragic. Bobby had spent his life protecting his brother from external threats, but no one could shield a man from destiny. That realization hung between them unspoken. At one point, Bobby leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes briefly, as if absorbing the reality that the conversation Dean described might have been one of Jack's final unguarded moments. The room fell quiet. Even the agent standing near the door seemed to understand that this was no longer about procedure. It was about something far more human. Dean left that building carrying a complicated mix of emotions. He felt sadness for the country, sadness for the family, and an unexpected sadness for Bobby himself. It is easy to judge vigilance from the outside. It is harder to understand what it feels like to live in constant defense mode. Bobby's earlier suspicion now seemed less personal and more symptomatic of a life lived in permanent alertness. When your role is to anticipate danger, you begin to see it everywhere. You start to believe that warmth might be a disguise and laughter might hide an agenda. That kind of mindset protects, but it also isolates. In the months that followed, Dean returned to performing, but something subtle had changed. On stage, the jokes still landed. The timing was still effortless. Yet behind the humor was a deeper awareness. When he looked out at the audience, he saw faces seeking escape, just as Kennedy had once sought escape in a private conversation. He began to understand his work differently. And entertainment was not trivial. It was relief. It was oxygen for people carrying invisible burdens. That realization gave his performances a new dimension. He was no longer just filling seats. He was providing respite. Meanwhile, Washington adjusted to a new presidency and a new rhythm, but the shadow of loss lingered. Dean heard through quiet channels that Bobby had kept a small item from the investigation as a personal reminder of his brother's final weeks. There was no public acknowledgement, no apology, no reconciliation scene. Life rarely offers such clean endings. Instead, understanding developed privately, over time, like a bruise fading slowly rather than disappearing all at once. Years passed. The world shifted again and again. Yet the memory of that meeting never lost clarity. Dean would occasionally reflect on how easily it could have been canceled. One decision from a cautious advisor, one security objection, one scheduling conflict, and that conversation would never have happened. That realization troubled him. In the name of safety, how many meaningful human exchanges are prevented? How many leaders are shielded so thoroughly that they forget what ordinary conversation feels like? The balance between protection and connection is delicate, and when it tilts too far toward control, something essential begins to erode. The irony, Dean realized, was that the handshake had not been dangerous at all. It had been grounding. It had reminded a president that outside of policy debates and global tensions, there existed a simple exchange between two individuals without expectations. That kind of interaction does not weaken leadership, it strengthens it. But institutions built on risk assessment often struggle to quantify the value of something intangible. They can measure threat levels and perimeter breaches, but they cannot easily measure loneliness. As the years unfolded, Dean came to see Bobby in a more compassionate light. Protection had been Bobby's language of love. Every skeptical glance, every stern question, every guarded stance was rooted in devotion. He had not tried to stop the handshake because he disliked Dean. He had tried to control a variable in a world where variables could become fatal. That is the paradox of power. The more responsibility you carry, the less spontaneous your life becomes. Every moment is filtered through caution. Every new face is evaluated for potential risk. And yet, and without moments of unfiltered connection, leadership becomes mechanical. When Bobby himself would later face violence, the cycle of tragedy felt almost unbearable. The country witnessed once again how fragile even the most protected lives can be. Dean watched that news with a heavy heart, understanding now that grief reshapes people in unpredictable ways. He thought about the intensity he had once interpreted as hostility and recognized it as fear of loss. There is a difference between suspicion born of arrogance and suspicion born of love. The latter often wears the same expression, but carries a different intention. In quieter interviews later in life, when asked about his brief encounter with President Kennedy, Dean spoke without drama. He did not embellish. He did not speculate. And he simply described a conversation that mattered because it was ordinary. That ordinariness was the gift. It was proof that even at the highest level of power, a person still longs for normalcy. A president is still a father, a husband, a man who occasionally needs to sit in a chair without being evaluated. The true story of that handshake is not about conspiracy or tension. It is about the invisible battle between vigilance and vulnerability. The Secret Service's instinct is to anticipate the worst. A performer's instinct is to disarm with warmth. When those instincts intersect, friction is inevitable. But friction does not always signal conflict. Sometimes it reveals two different forms of care colliding in the same space. Dean kept that perspective as he aged. That he understood that the moment had become symbolic not because it contained secret knowledge, but because it represented a pause in the machinery of power. It was a reminder that beneath institutions are individuals. Beneath strategy is humanity. And beneath every carefully guarded exterior is someone who occasionally just wants to speak freely. The story of that day has been retold in different ways over time, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes simplified. But at its core, it remains uncomplicated. A president invited a performer for a quiet conversation. Security observed cautiously. An attorney general guarded fiercely. And in the middle of all of it was a handshake that neither altered history nor predicted tragedy, but did something arguably just as meaningful. It affirmed that even in the most fortified building in America, authenticity can still slip through the cracks. That is what stayed with Dean long after headlines faded. Not the political implications, not the speculation. Just the understanding that sometimes the most powerful act is simply listening. And sometimes the greatest risk is not an external threat, but the gradual loss of connection in the name of safety. Time does something unusual to memory. It doesn't erase the sharp edges. It softens them. It doesn't remove the weight. It redistributes it. As the years moved forward, Dean Martin found that his memory of that afternoon in Washington did not fade. It deepened. The details became less about the building, less about the guarded corridors and the watchful agents, and more about the tone of the room, the way President Kennedy leaned back in his chair. What the quiet pause before he answered certain questions, the way his smile sometimes arrived a second later than expected, as if traveling through layers of responsibility before reaching his face. It was not the kind of meeting that changed the course of history. It did not alter policy. It did not create headlines. Yet in the quiet corners of Dean's mind, it held a significance that felt larger than many public triumphs. As America moved through the turbulence of the late 1960s and early 1970s, the country seemed to lose its innocence in waves. Protests filled streets. Trust in institutions shifted. The world became louder, angrier, and more divided. In that atmosphere, Dean often thought about the fragility of leadership. He had seen the inside of the White House for just 1 hour, yet that hour had revealed something television cameras never captured. It revealed how much of leadership is performance and how little of it allows for genuine vulnerability. The public saw confidence and resolve. What they did not see were the moments when the weight pressed inward and left no visible outlet. Dean's career continued to flourish. His performances remained effortless, his timing impeccable, his charm intact. Yet those closest to him noticed subtle changes. He became more reflective. Between shows, he would sit quietly rather than socialize endlessly. He listened more than he spoke. There was an increased sensitivity in him toward people who carried heavy responsibilities. Whether it was a fellow entertainer struggling under fame or a friend burdened by business pressures, Dean responded differently after that meeting. He understood something intangible now. He understood that even those who appear powerful are often searching for spaces where they can set that power down. Occasionally, reporters would ask him about politics. He rarely engaged, not because he lacked opinions, but because he had glimpsed the complexity behind the curtain. He knew that decisions made in Washington were rarely simple. They were layered with consequence, compromise, and unseen pressure. The handshake he had shared with Kennedy came to symbolize that complexity. It was a reminder that the man behind the title was not insulated from doubt. If anything, he carried more of it than anyone else. In private conversations with trusted friends, Dean would sometimes describe the atmosphere of that meeting in more detail. And he spoke about the sense of containment inside the White House, the way security created an invisible perimeter around spontaneity. He did not criticize it. He understood its necessity, but he also acknowledged the cost. When protection becomes constant, it can blur into isolation. Leaders become surrounded yet untouched, visible yet unreachable. The paradox of power is that it draws people close while simultaneously placing distance between them. Years later, when historical retrospectives revisited the Kennedy administration, analysts debated policy successes and failures. They examined international crises, domestic reforms, political strategies. Dean watched those discussions with interest, but felt detached from them. His memory of Kennedy was not framed by politics. It was framed by humanity. He remembered the president as a man momentarily relieved to speak without agenda. That memory remained consistent regardless of how history evaluated the administration. There were moments when Dean wondered whether the Secret Service agents present that day remembered it as he did. To them, it was likely just another scheduled engagement, another controlled interaction in a long list of security protocols. Yet perhaps even they recognized something subtle in the atmosphere. Protection requires constant assessment. Agents are trained to detect shifts in tone, in posture, in energy. If anyone understood the rarity of a relaxed presidential conversation, it would have been them. Dean imagined that behind their composed expressions, some of them may have recognized that what unfolded in that sitting room was not a threat, but a reprieve. But as the 1980s approached and nostalgia for earlier decades began to grow, Dean noticed a cultural longing for perceived simplicity. People spoke about the early 1960s as a different era, a more hopeful time. Yet Dean knew that even then, beneath the polished speeches and confident appearances, uncertainty existed. That is the nature of leadership in any era. There is always more happening beneath the surface than the public sees. The handshake had taught him that. One of the most profound shifts in Dean's perspective occurred not during interviews or performances, but in quiet moments alone. He would sit in his study and consider how easily that meeting could have been overshadowed by suspicion. In the weeks after the assassination, it would have been simple for narratives to spiral, for associations to be exaggerated, for innocent moments to be recast as suspicious. Instead, the truth remained straightforward. Two men spoke honestly for an hour. That simplicity felt almost radical in hindsight. Dean also reflected often on Bobby Kennedy. Time had softened his interpretation of Bobby's vigilance. What once felt intrusive now felt understandable. Grief reframes memory. Dean came to see Bobby's intensity as the manifestation of a protective instinct that had defined his life. To guard someone constantly is to live with a permanent edge of anxiety. When that protection ultimately fails against fate, the aftermath must feel devastating. Dean understood that the attempt to control the handshake was never about mistrust of him personally. It was about managing variables in an unpredictable world. As the years accumulated, Dean's own life took on a quieter tone. Fame that once felt electric began to feel routine. Public appearances grew less frequent. The spotlight dimmed slightly, replaced by introspection. In that stage of life, memories become companions. Some are loud and celebratory, others are quiet and reflective. The handshake belonged to the latter category. It did not dominate his thoughts daily, but when it surfaced, it carried a calm significance. He once remarked to a close friend that leadership is not defined solely by policy or public victories, but by the ability to remain human within systems that encourage detachment. The president he met had not been detached. He had been fully aware of his responsibilities, yet still searching for ordinary conversation. That search revealed strength rather than weakness. It takes courage to lower one's guard even briefly when the world watches constantly. In cultural discussions about security and openness, Dean's memory of that day felt increasingly relevant. Societies struggle with the balance between safety and freedom, between caution and authenticity. The White House is simply a concentrated version of that struggle. Every decision about access carries risk. Every restriction carries cost. The handshake symbolized that delicate equilibrium. It existed because caution allowed it under controlled conditions, yet it also pushed gently against the boundaries of predictability. As historians continued to analyze the period, Dean maintained his restraint. He refused to sensationalize his experience. He declined invitations to dramatize it. For him, its power lay precisely in its ordinariness, and it did not need embellishment. It did not require conspiracy. It was enough to know that for one afternoon, a president momentarily stepped out from behind layers of expectation and spoke candidly. When Dean reflected on legacy, he did not measure his life by awards or box office numbers. He thought about moments, small, contained exchanges that carried meaning beyond their duration. The handshake was one of those moments. It reaffirmed his belief that entertainment, though often dismissed as light, serves a deeper purpose. It reminds people of shared humanity. It creates pauses in otherwise relentless schedules. That afternoon in Washington was proof that even the most powerful individuals need those pauses. By the time Dean reached his later years, the memory no longer carried tension. It carried gratitude. And he was grateful that he had accepted the invitation. Grateful that the conversation had unfolded naturally. Grateful that it remained untainted by suspicion in the long run. The attempt to control it, to monitor it closely, only highlighted how rare such authenticity was in that environment. The long echo of that handshake extended far beyond its immediate context. It shaped how Dean viewed authority. It shaped how he interpreted vigilance. And it deepened his understanding of how fragile and precious genuine connection can be when layered with responsibility. History would remember President Kennedy through speeches and crises. Dean would remember him through a quiet room, 2 glasses of scotch, and a conversation unburdened by agenda. And perhaps that is the true power of human moments. And they rarely announce themselves as significant while they are happening. Only later do they reveal their depth. The handshake did not change history. It changed perspective. It revealed that beneath titles and layers of protection, every person, no matter how visible, still seeks the simple reassurance of being understood without expectation. As the final decades of Dean Martin's life unfolded, the world around him continued to change at a pace that would have seemed unimaginable in the early 1960s. New presidents came and went. New conflicts dominated headlines. Technology began shrinking distances between people while somehow widening emotional gaps. Yet amid all that movement, some memories remained still, preserved like pressed flowers inside a book. The afternoon he spent in Washington was one of those preserved moments. It did not demand attention every day, but it carried a quiet permanence, like a steady note beneath the melody of his life. Age alters how a man evaluates his past. What once felt dramatic begins to feel instructive. What once felt tense begins to feel understandable. Dean no longer saw that day as a clash between suspicion and sincerity. Instead, he began to see it as a portrait of competing forms of love. The Secret Service loved through vigilance. Bobby loved through control and relentless caution. The president himself seemed to long for love expressed through simple presence. Each form was valid in its own way. yet none could fully coexist without friction. That friction, Dean realized, was not failure. It was human complexity in motion. In quieter evenings, when the house was still and the noise of performance life had faded, Dean would sit in his study and allow his thoughts to wander back to that sitting room in the White House. He would remember the way Kennedy's voice lowered when speaking about responsibility, not in fear, but in acknowledgement. Leadership, as Dean had come to understand it, is not about removing doubt, but carrying it without letting it paralyze you. Kennedy had carried doubt with grace. That grace was what lingered in Dean's memory long after the headlines had yellowed with time. The meaning of the handshake evolved as the years passed. At first, it represented access, a rare glimpse behind the curtain of power. Later, it represented loss, the fragility of life even when surrounded by protection. But eventually, it came to represent something deeper: the necessity of human connection in environments designed for control. Institutions are built to maintain order, to anticipate risk, to limit unpredictability. Yet people are not institutions. They require warmth, spontaneity, laughter, vulnerability. When those elements are absent for too long, even the strongest individuals begin to feel isolated. Dean often considered how easily that meeting could have been prevented. A stricter advisor, a tighter schedule, a more cautious assessment. It would have taken very little to cancel it. That realization gave the memory additional weight. The most meaningful exchanges in life often exist at the edge of convenience. They happen because someone chooses openness over caution, even briefly. That choice carries risk, but it also carries possibility. Without risk, there is no authenticity. Without authenticity, leadership becomes performance without substance. In later interviews, when asked about power and politics, Dean would speak not about policy, but about humanity. He would explain that the true cost of leadership is not public criticism or political opposition. The true cost is the erosion of ordinary interaction. When every conversation is strategic, when every gesture is analyzed, spontaneity disappears. The handshake he shared with Kennedy symbolized the restoration of spontaneity, if only for an hour. It reminded the president that beyond titles and expectations, he was still simply a man capable of laughter and reflection. Dean also grew to appreciate Bobby Kennedy in a way that had not been possible immediately after their early tension. Time offers perspective that emotion cannot. He understood now that Bobby's watchfulness was not paranoia in the caricatured sense, but a product of proximity to responsibility. When your life revolves around protecting someone constantly exposed to danger, you begin to see the world through a lens of potential harm. That lens can distort warmth into suspicion. It can transform casual interaction into calculated risk, but at its core, it is born from devotion. Forgiveness entered Dean's reflections not as a grand declaration, but as a quiet shift. He did not need apologies or public acknowledgments. He did not need recognition for the role he played in offering the president a moment of relief. The understanding that developed over time was enough. Forgiveness, he realized, is less about excusing behavior and more about recognizing the burden behind it. Bobby's intensity had been the byproduct of love under pressure. When viewed through that lens, our resentment dissolved into empathy. As Dean's own health declined in his final years, the fragility of life became less abstract. He began to understand even more deeply the awareness Kennedy must have lived with daily. To hold a position where danger is constant requires a kind of internal negotiation. You cannot dwell on fear, yet you cannot ignore it. You must live fully while knowing vulnerability is permanent. That balance is delicate. Dean admired that balance in retrospect, recognizing that the calm he had witnessed in Kennedy was not naivete, but acceptance. The handshake itself took on almost symbolic qualities in his mind. It was brief. It was ordinary. It was unnoticed by cameras. And yet it endured longer in memory than many public ceremonies. And that endurance suggested something important. Significance is not always measured by spectacle. Sometimes it is measured by sincerity. The world often elevates grand gestures while overlooking quiet exchanges. But it is the quiet exchanges that shape how we understand one another. Dean's family occasionally asked him about that meeting, especially as documentaries and retrospectives revisited the era. He would recount it without embellishment, emphasizing the simplicity. "He just wanted to talk," he would say. Those 4 words carried everything. They stripped away conspiracy, tension, and myth. They restored the moment to its true form, a conversation. Nothing more, nothing less. In contemplating legacy, Dean began to see how intertwined lives can become through even the briefest contact. His career would be remembered for music and film, Kennedy's for policy and leadership, Bobby's for intensity and advocacy. Yet beneath those public identities existed personal intersections invisible to history books. Those intersections matter because they remind us that historical figures are not abstract symbols. They are individuals who share rooms, exchange words, and occasionally reach across divides with an outstretched hand. As the 20th century drew closer to its end, cultural discussions about security and openness became more pronounced. Societies debated how much access was too much, how much restriction was necessary. Dean listened to those debates with quiet insight. He had seen firsthand how protection can create distance. He had seen how necessary that protection can be. The balance remains unresolved, perhaps permanently. But he believed that within that balance, space must always be carved out for genuine interaction. Without it, leadership risks becoming mechanical, and the human spirit risks becoming secondary. In his final years, when physical energy waned and reflection replaced performance, the handshake remained vivid not as a dramatic turning point, but as a gentle affirmation. It affirmed that connection can exist even in fortified environments. It affirmed that vulnerability is not weakness, but courage. And it affirmed that sometimes the most lasting impact a person can have is not through influence or power, but through presence. When Dean passed away, those who reflected on his life spoke about his voice, his timing, his effortless charm. Few knew about the deeper lessons he carried quietly. But those lessons existed nonetheless. They existed in the way he approached conversation, in the empathy he extended toward burdened individuals, in the patience he showed toward complexity. The story of that handshake does not conclude with dramatic revelation. It concludes with understanding. The Secret Service did not attempt to stop danger. They attempted to control unpredictability. Bobby did not attempt to obstruct connection. He attempted to guard against harm. And the president did not seek escape from responsibility. He sought a moment to breathe within it. All 3 truths coexist. None negate the others. Legacy is often shaped by events beyond our control, but meaning is shaped by how we interpret those events over time. For Dean Martin, the meaning of that handshake evolved into something profound yet simple. Even in the most powerful rooms in the world, humanity remains the most valuable currency. Titles fade, administrations change, security protocols evolve. But the memory of one sincere conversation can endure across decades. And so, the story rests there, not in controversy or conspiracy, but in reflection. A handshake that lasted seconds carried echoes that lasted a lifetime, not because it altered history, but because it illuminated something timeless. Beneath the layers of authority, protection, and expectation, every person longs to be understood without agenda. That longing is universal. It bridges fame and office, performer and president, protector and protected. In the end, that was the true significance of the moment. It was not about politics. It was about presence. And presence, when offered sincerely, leaves a mark no security perimeter can prevent, and no passage of time can erase.